And we are back on this 0 hour. Joining us now to talk politics is one of my favorite political writers. John Nichols is the Washington correspondent for The Nation. He also writes a blog for The Nation called The Beat, and he is the author or co-author of a bunch of great books. I'm not going to go through all of them, but check them out. John Nichols, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad you didn't go through all the books.
Yeah, well, you know, we got limited time.
I'm writing a new one now, so we'll do that next. We'll do that sometime down the line.
And just to be, if you got a new book, I want to talk about that because I didn't know that. But let's be clear, you're not the John Nichols who wrote the Milagro Beanfield War.
No, but that's benefited me greatly over the years. I go to many events where I'm ushered to the front and treated very, very well, right up until they realize I'm not that guy.
Good. Well, the advantage and disadvantage of a name like Eskow is nobody confuses you for anybody else, so you got to live with what you do. But listen, there's a lot I want to talk to you about, including now I'm adding to the agenda the new book. But I want to start with, you've been putting out a lot of great stuff lately, but one of the things I want to talk about with you is Scott Walker, because a number of people have noted the fact that Scott Walker appears to be the favorite of the infamous Koch brothers, but I want to get your insight on that, not only because you're one of the smartest political reporters we have, and not only because you're in Wisconsin, but because you have insight. I want you to give me a reality check on my impression of Scott Walker, which is that he's kind of a dick.
Well, that's a very rough comment about my old friend, a guy I used to spend quite a bit of time with. Back 20 years ago, Scott Walker fancied himself something of a reformer and even was involved in efforts to do some campaign finance reform and transparency bills. He will, I don't think I have to remind folks now, probably prefer that we don't bring that up, because he has now become the great champion of money in politics. And there's nobody deeper into the Kochs pockets, deeper into the big money pocket than Scott Walker.
The great champion and the great beneficiary of, it seems, of money in politics. And by the way, I was reality checking my impression. I meant to say jerk. That slipped out. But of course, I could be completely wrong, and he could be a wonderful human being. It's just my impression is this guy is cynical. He's pandering. He is vindictive. But again, that doesn't really distinguish him in his line of work either. So
I was going to say, how are you speaking negatively of him in that regard in American politics today? That is
right.
That is unfortunately all too common. But
it is.
Let us be clear. Scott Walker is arguably the most cynical person I have ever seen in politics. He is, and that's where we get it kind of out of the narrow discussion into something specific about this guy. He is absolutely willing and capable of saying one thing to your face and then doing something absolutely different in very short order. In 2014, he ran for re-election as governor of Wisconsin, constantly saying he wasn't interested in right to work. He thought it was a distraction. He thought more anti-labor legislation was going to divide the state. Again and again saying this to the people who were considering whether to give him another term. And within months after his re-election, he not only signed an anti-labor right to work bill, but he posed holding it up and talking about what a great accomplishment it was, and then flew out to Washington to meet with right-wingers to chirp about it. So the fact is, he is, on virtually any issue, willing and capable of saying one thing and doing another. But the one group of people that he never, ever disappoints are his big donors. That's the group of people that he never lets down. And he is a very devoted, very determined advocate for their agendas, both as regards politics and as regards governing. I mean, what they want, he happens to be across the board in favor of. So do the Koch brothers like Scott Walker? No. They loved Scott Walker. They adore Scott Walker. He is discussed at Koch brothers meetings as the model governor, literally as good as you get. If there's a Koch brother governor, he's the man. And so he's absolutely adored by both Koch brothers.
So he's the prototype politician for the Koch brothers. He's the T-1000. He's the new model. And and he's what frightens me most about what you're saying is that in my experience, when it comes right down to it, politics can be a kind of cynicism triathlon where the guy or person with the most endurance and the most gut level commitment to cynicism wins, which gets me to my next point, which is, and we're talking with John Nichols, Washington correspondent for The Nation, about Scott Walker of Wisconsin. It gets me to my next point, which is, hey, all the talk is that while the Koch brothers aren't formally endorsing them at this point, he's their boy for the presidency. And as you wrote, you mentioned David Koch's comment that the 2016 Republican nominee, quote unquote, should be Scott Walker. So are they just holding back because maybe a new model will come along, the T-1001 that they like even better, or what's the
No, it's different than that. It's different than that. First off, and this may be news to you. I don't know how much you're getting out, but having the endorsement of the Koch brothers is not necessarily the best thing in politics. It's very, very useful behind the scenes. It's very, very useful to get the money. But to be the Koch brothers candidate, especially if you're going into a November election, if you're actually the nominee of your party, it's not something you necessarily are going to run down the street and jump up and down for.
Right.
And
even Republicans, you think? Even if you're running as...
Yeah. I mean, remember, one thing to understand about the Republican Party is that it is an elite party at its upper echelons, but if you get down to the grassroots, I think it'd be very, very interesting, say if Scott Walker was the Koch brothers candidate, and you're Mike Huckabee, for instance, and you say, boy, what do I think about the Koch brothers? Well, they're actually in favor of, a lot of initiatives to address the drug war. They are concerned about mass incarceration. They have a lot of what many people might see as socially liberal positions, if you understand what I'm saying. I actually could imagine a populist inside the Republican candidacy against the Koch candidate. So right off the bat, simply grabbing that Koch brothers endorsement is not necessarily something that a particular candidate or even the Koch brothers themselves would tell you is perfect politics. But let's put all that aside. There's something that goes much deeper here. And that is that despite the fact that the Koch brothers really, really like Scott Walker a lot, very supportive, and they've poured resources into getting him elected, seeing him through a recall, getting him reelected. No doubt of that. They've been very, very supportive of the man. But they don't care about personalities, and they don't even care about the people they like the best. What they care about, and this is why they've been very successful in business, and frankly, why they've been quite successful in politics, what they care about is power. And their goal in 2016 is not to elect an individual to the White House. Their goal in 2016 is to get control of the White House. They have assembled the better part of $1 billion, their own money and that of their allies and supporters. They intend to spend that money to help the Republican candidates, not just for the White House, but presumably House and Senate, get elected. And they're not going to squander that money on, a favorite in the primaries, at least not in the early stages. If it gets to a critical test, they might step in. But they're not gonna jump up and start spending that money now in a divisive, complex Republican fight. They simply want a Republican nominee that they can live with. And here's the important thing to understand. Scott Walker may be their model governor, but the truth of the matter is most of these candidates, most of the major candidates have appeared at Koch brothers events. have accepted either support or sympathy from the Koch brothers, have moved legislation that the Koch brothers like. And so it's not as if it is urgent for them to step into a Republican primary process. And that's the important thing to understand. It's sort of a tough thing for Scott Walker, because
Right.
Scott Walker would love to have all that money flow his way. He especially, because despite the fact that he's running very well in the polls, there's no guarantees that he can overcome the Bush family's money. There's no guarantees that he can overcome a lot of the personal appeal of some of these other candidates. And if you'll note, his polling right now nationally is, in the latest CNN poll, he's behind Bush, and
Right.
he's
I did
basically
notice
just
that.
tied. He's just
And he
tied.
doesn't do as, and Scott Walker doesn't do as well in the polling I've seen right now, at least, against Hillary Clinton. So we're talking with John Nichols of The Nation about the Koch brothers and Scott Walker. So if I hear you correctly, if I'm David Koch, my calculation is, well, I want to let the Republicans, I want to let the world know I like this guy, but I'm not going to spend a lot of money on him because most of the candidates will be acceptable to me. If I'm thinking like an executive, then I'm thinking, well, okay, let's see who shows me what they've got, and then I'll step in when the time is right, because all these guys are basically going to follow my instructions. And maybe on top of that, if I'm quoted as saying Scott Walker should be the nominee, maybe that's a little wake-up call to the other guys too, just to pay attention to what I want as they move through this process. Fair kind of summary?
Nailed it. That's exactly right. And that's the mistake that a lot of people made initially when you saw those comments from Koch. There were a lot of folks who said, oh, well, there you go. Kochs have picked their candidate. And that was actually essentially a initial New York Times online headline. Not to pick on the person that wrote that. I think that, you get information, you move it along as it develops. But that is a mistake. The better way to understand this is exactly how you just described it, and also to really recognize that for the Koch brothers, and frankly for a number of these other incredibly wealthy figures who have begun to use the Republican Party as their political playground, candidates are interchangeable. I mean, this is a big deal. Remember Sheldon Adelson back in 2012. He kept Newt Gingrich's candidacy alive.
Absolutely.
He literally kept Newt Gingrich on the road. And then when Gingrich was no longer useful to him, did he go, well, I'm sorry, the only man I think can be president of the United States is Newt Gingrich? No. He immediately flipped over to helping Romney. I mean, that's the way to understand this.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, on that point, well, first of all, my pet name, this will just convince you I'm nasty, but the name I kept using for Newt Gingrich during the campaign was Dr. Strange, because he had such odd ideas. But I was reading somewhere, and I can't remember now, but a new study showing that virtually all the increase in dark money contributions comes from individuals. So, and a lot of the visible money too. So we're really seeing a situation where a Sheldon Adelson or Koch brothers can, as you say, keep a candidacy alive. Now, and we're talking with John Nichols of The Nation. Now, here's an interesting thing, John, about the whole process. It's interesting to me that of all the candidates you mentioned, Mike Huckabee, because look, unless you disagree, I consider him an extreme long shot for the nomination. There are just too many quirky things about him. But again, he's a guy. Somebody might decide to become his patron too, I guess. But he has been taking a sort of intermittently populist tone.
Mm-hmm.
And what he did this week with, you had all these guys falling all over each other to show how much, no, I'll cut Social Security more than Chris Christie. No, I'll cut Social Security more than Jeb Bush. You had Mike Huckabee come in and say, gosh, I don't think, I'm paraphrasing, but gosh, I don't think we should break the government's promise to American seniors. So he might be a guy who takes, don't you think?
No, you're exactly right. And there's two things about Mike Huckabee to understand. And it's not the same issues, but it's also similar with Rand Paul. First thing is, Mike Huckabee is actually more appealing in a lot of ways to a lot of voters than most of the Republican contenders. Mm-hmm. That's number one. Number two, the elites don't trust him and don't like him. Number two. This is the interesting dynamic with both Huckabee and Paul. And the reason is that, especially in Huckabee's case, he has always had a bit of a populist streak. Now, in Paul's case, he has always had a bit of an isolationist streak, and each of these things frighten elites that are huge into global trade, huge into, too often, wars. But let's keep on Huckabee for 1 second. Huckabee is very, very interesting in a lot of ways. Back in 2008, when he sought the presidency, he actually went out of his way to reach out to unions. He ran with a, kind of a pat on the back from the machinists union that said, to their members, if you're going to vote in a Republican primary, vote for Mike Huckabee. And so this is a guy who has always been interested in that old-fashioned concept of building a socially very conservative, but potentially economically a little bit populist coalition. It's something Democrats ought to, frankly, be a little afraid of in some ways, because it has some potential in a number of states. But interestingly enough, it also has real resonance in one state, and one state that matters a lot. It's
Iowa.
They like Mike Huckabee a lot in Iowa.
Yeah.
He's known there. Remember, the Iowa caucus is fiercely anti-democratic. I actually don't mind the Iowa caucuses because they do, people are very engaged, they're very interested. But truthfully, most Iowans don't vote in the caucuses. It's a tiny number of people who go, and the people who go are disproportionately people who tend to like where Mike Huckabee stands on a lot of social issues. I mean, tend to really connect with him.
Well,
and so he's viable.
And the interesting thing, it's interesting. In a way, I'm glad to hear he's viable because, we're going to run out of time, unfortunately, because there's so much I want to talk to you about, including what you, I think, described as Hillary Clinton's soft populism. But I have actually, from time to time, wished for a Republican who would have some populist appeal and would force Democrats across the board to put some meat on the bones of their own populism rather than just kind of mouthing generalities about it. So he also reminds me, when I would play in a church rock and roll band as a teenager with my Southern Baptist cousins of the he's a former pastor of the pastor who would come over and say, fellas, Jesus was actually a pretty hip guy when you know his story, which is, it's appealing in its own way, even if you're not part of that world.
Of course it is. Of course it is. And it's more than that. He plays bass. He could have been in your band.
Right. Right. I don't know how good he is. No, but
I saw him with Ted Nugent once on his show. It was pretty amazing.
Okay.
But and really a cultural moment there, I think. But the thing about Mike Huckabee is that he does try to reach out. He's still in the context of what, frankly, is becoming, I hate to say, kind of an old-fashioned politics, i.e., that you actually kind of listen to the voters and you figure out what they're interested in and try and talk about some of that rather than just jamming something down their throat, which is what big money politics is all about. Saying, here are the issues we're going to hype up. Here's, what you should care about, blah, blah, blah. Huckabee goes a different route, makes him an interesting player. He's not going to be the nominee, but he has the potential to be a real thorn in the side of anybody who emerges as the Republican frontrunner, because he could, frankly, probably, I should say not certainly, but probably run as something more of a purist.
All right.
And a bit of grassroots appeal.
We're going to have to get out. Give us, if you would, I hate to do this to you, cut it so short, but one sentence on your new book.
It's about the end of work. It's about how apps and robots are going to be driving a lot of people out of work, and how we have to up the democracy quotient so that we decide the future of our economy, not a bunch of billionaires.
Well, I'll tell you what, will you come back on the show and talk to us about that?
Anytime.
All right, you got it. We've been talking with John Nichols, Washington correspondent for The Nation, about the political scene on the Republican side. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Total pleasure.
We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.